Poetry is the key. Awareness found in wanderings, evoking traces of the hand of darkness to make ephemeral landscapes. My own embodied hydra. I am not something human, a being long before dreamed of force stronger than myself. We are the music with nothing left over, wild, irreducible aching, a primal roar bearing witness to the saying of being itself. Poetry is the key for my attempt at essay as art, because poetry captures and extends creativity and imagination, providing a finite form to the infinite, thereby bringing it within the grasp of pan-human awareness that is at the same time seeped in as well as free from context. In an unusual article in an academic literacy journal, Lisa Patrick argues that academic researchers should explore poetic forms of presentation and includes found poems based on her own article. Here is an excerpt of one. Experiment with scientific and artistic language. But is it poetry? Challenge prose as the sole legitimate carrier of knowledge. But is it scholarship? Trouble the dichotomy between science and art. But is it poetry? Resist limitations imposed by the hegemony of research discourse. But is it scholarship? Persuading researchers to create space for new genres, methodological tools, forms of representation. Expanding the creative boundaries of scientific research. Setting aside her rather broad definition of scientific research, she demonstrates that it is indeed possible to challenge prose as the sole legitimate carrier of knowledge. Again, we encounter the question of form and function. The traditional academic form has been challenged by theory fiction, which uses the logic of narrative to explore traditionally academic fields, concordant with Haraway's SF. Friedrich Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra could be considered an early example, in which he expounds his philosophical view through the wanderings of his titular character. Writer and academic Saidiya Hartman's method of critical fabulation combines historical research and narrative, evoking the stories of people whose lives have left mere traces in the records, giving access to an understanding that is simply not available through traditional academic writing. Indeed, even before theory fiction was discussed in the academic world, Ursula Le Guin wrote SF novels such as The Left Hand of Darkness. Set on a planet when there is only one gender, she is able to explore how gender functions on our planet. Terry Pratchett is another example of a novelist who wrote theory fiction, in his case harnessing the advantages of fantasy and humour. For example, Small Gods is a treatise on religion, belief, and ethics. Examples of theory poetry can also be found. Charles Reznikoff's Testimony uses found poetry based on trial transcripts to chart the industrialization of the USA at the turn of the 20th century. Poet and visionary William Blake's illuminated verse combines visual art and poetry to explore and critique the philosophical and political concepts of his time. How poetry would work for an actual scientific paper is a matter for another discourse, but it seems inherently suited to presenting research in the artistic field, as poetry becomes not just a cultural tool to communicate, but also a precious ability to evocate, to make the ephemeral eternal, appealing to creativity and imagination as the landscapes where cultural realities interweave emotions, feelings, values, and decisions in different layers of living philosophies. Here, I use my own poems, found in each section, as introductory epigraphs. But rather than theory poetry, this essay is an attempt at theory art using the logic of poetry. As Morton writes, a truly theoretical approach is not allowed to sit smugly outside the area it is examining. It must mix thoroughly with it. Thus, I mix my art and philosophy, integrating theory and practice in an embodied approach. While this might be an opportune moment to look at the multitude of artworks that could be embraced by the idea of theory art, that would be to fall prey to the Lernaean hydra, or, excuse the pun, the learning hydra, when avenues of learning multiply at an exponential rate. Instead, I focus on learning through the application of my own process to determine what theory art looks like for me. By the term poetry, I am not referring to verse alone. Tarkovsky states that, when I speak of poetry, I am not thinking of it as a genre. Poetry is an awareness of the world, a particular way of relating to reality, a philosophy to guide a man through his life. However, in my use here, poetry is not a form of insight or philosophy, or something human to use or apply, as poetry is not a quintessentially human quality. Limiting poetry to the human realm is overly anthropocentric. When I speak of poetry, it is of a constituent or property of being. Like shapeliness and grace, symmetry and love, it must be made as well as found, but it is made, it seems to me, by creatures other than human beings, and found in countless contexts far from human language. To paraphrase an unattributed quote in nature writer Robert Macfarlane's book The Wild Places, poetry was here long before we were even dreamed. It watched us arrive. As an artist working in multiple media, from paint to photography to performance to fiber arts, for me the phenomenological experience of making art, the dialectical relationship with the medium, feels the same whatever the medium happens to be. After all, we speak of composition in relation to visual art, poems, prose, and music. Words such as ambient, tone, balance, colour, etc. can be used of virtually any art form, although more metaphorically of some than of others. This commonality of language suggests a shared experiential, phenomenological aspect in both making and viewing art, which are both manifestations of finding poetry in the world. Other metaphors can be used to express this aspect of creative existence. I see my idea of poetry in philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty's idea of art as conceptless presentation of universal being, and his claim that the actions most proper to the artist seem to emanate from the things themselves, like the patterns of the constellations. Artist Paulo Rego said, "I always hoped to discover something immensely mysterious by trying to draw it." Writer and literary critic Helen Sixou's Angel at Your Shoulder captures something similar. Writing, thinking, is being in state of waiting for what is yet to come, but proclaims itself. Proclamation and imminence. A force stronger than myself comes up behind me, and, I guess, painting is the same way, with the angel at your shoulder and eyes that listen and do not see. Author Virginia Woolf also expressed a similar sentiment. It is the rapture I get when in writing I seem to be discovering what belongs to what. From this I reach what I might call a philosophy, that behind the cotton wool is hidden a pattern, that we, I mean all human beings, are connected with this, that the whole world is a work of art, that we are parts of the work of art. We are the words, we are the music, we are the thing itself. My monstrous regiment is a series of long exposure film photographs capturing my performance with a scarf, creating winged beings. The stop-motionist film I created from these photographs, Nothing Left Over, evokes a tortured dance. The criterion I used to select images from over 90 negatives was their poetry, a mysterious, emanating hidden pattern I could not plan for or control, but only discover with my eyes that listen and do not see. I chose those that had a beauty more profound than just pleasing aesthetics. In Morton's words, beauty is wild, spectral, haunting, irreducible, uncanny. This, again, is poetry. With reference to Kant, Morton writes that beauty gives you a fantastic, impossible access to the inaccessible, to the withdrawn, open qualities of things, their mysterious reality. The photographs of Sig Harvey demonstrate this aspect, capturing moments of poetry in the day-to-day. They have an aching beauty, a fragility, tension, even pain. She says her pictures are an urgent call to live, a primal roar. Be here now. Experience this. Feel this. Harvey also describes her work as searching for and bearing witness to beauty, an invitation to experience the natural world in an immersive way, and to find and to celebrate beauty in the world. This chimes with the words of psychology professor Jan Valsner, who writes that every moment of feeling beauty is poetic. Although here I equate beauty with my concept of poetry, I want to clearly distinguish poetry as I use it here from poetics, in the sense of the study of aesthetics or its use in literary theory. Poetics is set apart for concentrating on intrinsic characteristics of literature as a system. It does not attempt to determine the meaning of literary works, but asks how they function. In this use, poetics is a word of the academy, an institutional term, which I wish to avoid because institutions close their doors and windows, leaving poetry outside. That does no harm to poetry, of course. It only harms the institutions. Bachelard presents a different take on poetics, which is perhaps more akin to my idea of poetry. In the introduction to The Poetics of Space, Richard Kearney writes that poetics comes from poesis, meaning to make, and for Bachelard this is a two-way process. We are inhabited by deep imaginings, visual and verbal, auditory and tactile, that we re-inhabit in our own unique way. For Bachelard, imagination was at once receptive and creative, an acoustic listening and an art of participation. The world itself dreams, he said, and we help give it voice. The highest act of imagination is the will to attune oneself to the saying of being itself. Similarly, Bringhurst posits that the fundamental task is to honour what is, by articulating the poetry in things. He describes the creative act as a form of primary translation of the poetry inherent in the world. It can be portrayed in equations, images, and stories. We try to capture it in action and in language. the languages of words, the languages of music, the languages of gestures and forms, the languages of mathematics.